My name is Luke Tillman with cbec Engineering, and I'm going to be giving an overview for the Escondido Creek Grape Day Park concept, the 30% design for the project that we at cbec Engineering have been working with Anne Van Leer of the Escondido Creek Conservancy for the last several years to develop this from kind of a concept for creek restoration within the Grape Day Park reach of Escondido Creek into kind of a multi-objective urban green space and water quality improvement project. And so this title slide just gives a nice drone image overview of the site that we're talking about here. This is Escondido Creek running through Grape Day Park in downtown Escondido, California. We can see the City Hall is kind of on the left side of the park here. We've got the California Center for the Arts. We have the Woodward parking lot facility and James Stone swimming pool, and we've got the Boys and Girls Club more in the foreground here. And Escondido Creek kind of runs right through the middle of this in this concrete-lined rectangular channel. So we're ultimately going to have a couple different parts to this presentation in two different videos. The first part is going to be about the project background, bringing us from the existing conditions to the 30% design, and then we're going to have another video that's going to focus in on the water quality benefits and alternative compliance. So for part one, the project background, we're going to go from existing conditions, looking at some prior studies, some inspirations for the project, an assessment of how feasible it is to do a project within the flood control channel, and then bringing in visions for Grape Day Park as the design changed somewhat. That brings us to our 2019 concept that had been presented previously, and ultimately what design changes had been brought in from that point to the 30% design over the last couple of years. So for existing conditions, one of the first things we can look at here is kind of a transect of photographs of Escondido Creek, all taken on the same day in mid-August 2018, and we're moving from the upstream end of the watershed at this upper left image all the way down to the downstream end as we get beyond Harmony Grove Road and we're back into the natural channel. And so we can see that we're progressing from a natural channel into a concrete lined flood control channel that through Grape Day Park ultimately becomes a rectangular channel, and we eventually transition back into the natural channel after we get south or downstream of Harmony Grove Road. One important thing to note here is that there's this flow within the channel as we go further and further downstream, while we don't have any coming in from the upstream end. This isn't the result of recent precipitation, but these are dry season flows that are entering Escondido Creek at a time where the creek should naturally be dry as a result of urban watering like lawn irrigation and other irrigation and other commercial and industrial uses, as well as potential groundwater seepage into the storm drain system or the MS4 system. So that brings us to some of the water quality concerns. We touched on those dry weather flows, but ultimately the Water Quality Improvement Plan lists the highest priority water quality condition for the Escondido Creek Watershed as riparian habitat degradation. So the presence of non-native vegetation, concrete-lined channels throughout the system, dry weather flows, trash, and other water quality concerns, which include Clean Water Act Section 303D listings for various pollutants and nutrients. So Escondido Creek has quite a few water quality concerns that have motivated kind of previous studies to understand how some of these pollutant loads and other water quality conditions could be mitigated. An important one was the City of Escondido Creek's hydraulic study by Michael Baker International, and they had looked at a couple analyses for Grape Day Park and throughout the city that ultimately become important for the 30% design for this project. The first analysis that we touch on is the fact that they had looked at naturalization alternatives for Escondido Creek through Grape Day Park and tried to understand what would it take to be able to actually remove concrete from the channel through Grape Day Park and actually create more of a naturalized surface where we have vegetation and grade control structures. Ultimately, they found through several alternatives that being able to remove the concrete and replace it with more natural surfaces that would allow you to percolate these dry season flows, that would allow the 100-year water surface elevation to increase by between 2.2 and 11.7 feet. So the flood elevation within the channel gets very high as a result of changing the channel geometry here. And they found that you would need to increase the channel width by over a factor of 4 times the existing channel width to be able to convey the same amount of flow when you go in and you modify it to be more naturalized. So that's an important starting off point for an early form of our design, which looked at alternatives for kind of a creek restoration project within the channel corridor. And they'd also looked at underground BMPs, or best management practices, for stormwater retention and infiltration throughout the city, where these might be located to allow you to remove water from the MS4 or the storm drain network and treat it on site and let it evaporate or percolate, or just store it in underground tanks, so that you prevent a lot of this flow from entering Escondido Creek. It's preventing a lot of pretty dirty, contaminated water from entering the creek. So this is just a quick figure that comes from the Michael Baker study, which shows that they had identified the Woodward parking lot here at Grape Day Park as a good candidate for an underground storage tank that's connected to the MS4 pipes that are shown in blue. So these are our underground storage storm sewer pipes that are then connecting into Escondido Creek, and they're actually siphoning off water to fill up this tank and then allow that tank to percolate water into the ground and prevent it from entering Escondido Creek. So that's something that we'll return to. But initially we were looking at the feasibility of doing an in-channel modification project to try to naturalize the channel of Escondido Creek through Grape Day Park. And we had a few different possibilities for design, which involved kind of taking up land into the Woodward parking lot in various ways. So one possibility is that you could, instead of just having 2 vertical walls on either side of the channel, you could kind of lay back one of the walls at an angle, kind of a sloped wall, and you vegetate it and you have natural surfaces on there. So you're increasing the flow width to try to get at that issue of allowing flood flows to still move through a channel with adequate capacity. We can also do an inset floodplain, where you actually excavate a large portion of that parking lot. You grade it down low so that water, when the water stage, or the elevation of the water surface elevation within the channel, as that rises when you have a flood event, it'll spill into this inset floodplain and kind of pool out there and give it a large amount of area for it to kind of percolate and expand, allow the flow to expand around the naturalized section of the creek. This can also double as recreation space. And then we also have a concept for a connected side channel, where you leave the flood control channel kind of as it is, so you maintain the vertical walled concrete lined channel and allow it to operate under flood conditions as it currently does. But during non-flood conditions, you would allow water to be diverted from Escondido Creek into a side channel that then can allow for natural vegetation and walking paths and percolation of these flows. And so we'll kind of discuss how each of these designs progressed initially. Some of the things that motivated this initial phase of the project, looking at in-channel modifications or restoration projects, we have San Luis Obispo, California. And so Mission Plaza is a really good example of how in-stream restoration can work in a downtown area, where we can see this is right downstream of what's called the Undercity Culvert, where San Luis Obispo Creek disappears underneath downtown, and it's covered for a few blocks in kind of a tunnel. And it emerges from this tunnel into this area where we have relatively steep vertical walls, we have a lot of concrete, but we have a natural channel bottom and large boulders within the creek that allow people to walk across the creek and kind of interact with it without really getting in and touching the water. This is not something that would be immediately feasible within Grape Day Park of Escondido Creek, but it's a good example of having urban stream restoration kind of for the purpose of increasing recreation access and for the purpose of driving economic redevelopment, where this area has had kind of a renaissance in commercial development around this site, where people want to dine and walk and be along this portion of the creek. Another vision and inspiration area is Davis, California, where we have the University of California, Davis sits along the historic channel of Pewter Creek as it comes out of the hills from Lake Berryessa, and it flows into the valley and toward the Yola Bypass. Historically, the channel of Pewter Creek had flown through the city of Davis, but in an effort to reduce flooding, the Army Corps of Engineers had actually redirected the river to flow along a different path. And so they kind of cut off the old channel alignment. And now this area is the historic creek bed of Pewter Creek, but it ultimately acts as kind of a stormwater detention pond for the university. So a lot of the runoff from the university and the surrounding streets enters into this arboretum, which also features pumps that recirculate the water through here, and there's walking trails. But you wouldn't necessarily know that you're not within a natural creek system when you're walking along this. There's wildlife in here. There's many ducks and turtles and sometimes even otters that use the arboretum. And so even though these aren't directly analogous to the types of projects that we'd be looking at for Escondido, it's important to kind of understand how other cities have looked at this idea of blending recreation and habitat with stormwater management and pollutant load reduction in creative ways that are attractive to people. So one thing that we progressed with was looking at this inset floodplain concept within the Woodward parking lot. And we use what's called a hydraulic model to try to determine how feasible that is. And a hydraulic model is using a computer to simulate how the river functions. So we have information about what the river looks like, how wide it is, how steeply sloped it is, what the surface is made of, and then we use these equations that calculate how quickly water is moving and how deep it gets and things like that. And ultimately, we have water that's moving through very fast in the 100-year flood event, where you have, it's almost kind of like a water slide. Water is just really moving very quickly through this reach. And so if you try to do things like create an inset floodplain to allow flow to expand and you slow down that water, you can create some really complicated flow hydraulics that actually cause what we call a hydraulic jump, which is kind of a standing wave that can form when you get these changes from different types of flow, very fast moving flow to slower moving flow. You can have these standing waves form. So we were seeing flood impacts as a result of various alternatives for trying to do an in-channel modification. And so with that kind of limitation in mind, we shifted to looking at the side channel concept, where it became important to think about in terms of safety from both flood control perspective and in terms of being able to limit people's access to the channel at times where it's dangerously flooding. A connected side channel concept became kind of the more favorite option initially. So as we touched on, we have flows of about 30 feet per second, flow velocities at about 30 feet per second, and we ultimately try to go for the side channel concept, where we have multi-objective considerations, where we want to maintain the flood capacity of the flood control channel. We want to incorporate into existing plans for Grape Day Park, provide for recreation activities and public access, create urban habitat, improve water quality, especially for stormwater and in the first pulse flows that are coming through here, and something that could be an economic and driver for downtown redevelopment. So we had looked at a few other plans for what had been proposed for Grape Day Park so that we would try to have synergy between our design and what had already been discussed. And one of those is the Grape Day Park Master Plan, which has kind of a vision for modifications to the park itself, kind of realignment of trails and addition of features within Grape Day Park, as well as a potential realignment of and reconstruction of the James A. Stone swimming pool, kind of modifications to the parking lot, and pedestrian plazas and potential pedestrian connections to expand access to Grape Day Park. We'd also looked at the People to the Park concept, which considered expanding Grape Day Park into the parking lot and also beyond Woodward Avenue and having a park that extends all the way up to West Washington Avenue. And so when we were looking at our initial concept in 2019, which has changed quite a bit when we get to this point, or from this point to the 30% design, we had tried to come up with something that would have this side channel concept to meet all of the criteria that I mentioned previously, and to fit into some of these design elements like the Grape Day Park master plan and the People to the Park plan, where we're taking up a large amount of the Woodward parking lot for this side channel. We've added in boardwalk features and walking trails, and ultimately the way that this was proposed to work is that in the wintertime, when you have potential floods coming through, the flood control channel just operates as it typically does. But in the dry season, and maybe even in later portions of the wet season, once a lot of your large flood events have already passed through, you would use kind of a little raisable weir, or almost a small dam within the creek, to build up a reservoir of water that you can then pump up into this side channel to circulate through the channel, that then returns back to the creek after it's had time to move through the channel and move through a pond and wetland area to try to improve the water quality before it's actually returned. So this is just a zoom in on the 2019 concept, which had been discussed in various public meetings and settings. And it's important to note that this is not the 30% design. This was kind of an intermediate stepping point still to where we're going with 30% design. But we can see some elements like a potential lid over Escondido Creek to extend the bike trail into the park. We see all these opportunities for recreation that kind of complement the hydrologic features of the site. We needed to reevaluate this direct connection to Escondido Creek when we get into the discussion of alternative compliance, which is ultimately the ability for developers to purchase credits to mitigate for any impacts that they have to stormwater as a result of developing their project. If you're not able to mitigate for the impacts that you have to runoff on your site when you develop a site, you can purchase credits to be able to mitigate for those losses at a different location. And so they kind of create these mitigation banks for these types of credits. But ultimately, we'd only be able to use this if we're treating wet season flows from the MS4, not by taking Escondido Creek flows and then running them through this. And so this was kind of a turning point in the design to shift away from actually having water that comes directly from Escondido Creek to now using water that's coming through the MS4 to feed our side channel concept. But in order to also make sure you have enough water to draw upon, you're not just going to be pumping water out of the MS4 pipes, but we go back to this concept that the Michael Baker study had introduced about having an underground storage tank that's connected to those pipes that we then further connect to this surface feature. So this is going back to the hydraulic study from Michael Baker, and they had called this Woodward Avenue parking lot facility Site 9 in their analyses. And this is just showing in red the watershed, or all the area that's draining to the two MS4 pipes that go on either side of this potential underground storage tank. So we're draining about 25 acres of land. And when we look at their image of what the watershed actually looks like with an aerial behind it, an aerial image, we see that this is, very highly developed land. It's all impervious surfaces. It's predominantly commercial land in these red areas, some multifamily residential, and then we have transportation, which is all these road surfaces. And so they had looked at this at sizing how large this tank would need to be in order to have sufficient volume to remove flow from the MS4 pipes and percolate it back into the ground. But now we want to, bring this type of design feature into our design, where we don't just want to put a tank in the ground that then releases water into the ground by percolating it. We still want to have this kind of surface feature for all of the reasons that we talked about. So when we revisit the goals of our design, we have, we're trying to pursue water quality benefits. So we want to treat the first flush flows that come through that carry a large amount of pollutants into Escondido Creek as they, after a long summertime, oil and other debris have filled up on the streets, and then the first rain really washes a lot of this very dirty material into the creek. So being able to pull as much of that away from the creek as possible before it enters is a large goal of the project, as well as just treating wet season flows in general. And then the potential for alternative compliance, which we'll talk about in the second session. We also have goals for urban green space, where we want to create microhabitats here and create access to nature for disadvantaged communities, which was a main focus of the grant that funded this work. We also want to just overall create a public amenity in the downtown core that would provide these expanded recreation opportunities for Grape Day Park and potentially act as an economic development driver for the region. So with a lot of this information in mind and restating these goals, we moved toward a refined design for the 30% design compared to that 2019 concept. So this is the 2021 30% design. We can still see some elements of having, pedestrian plazas and trails, boardwalk features, and a surface channel, but we have kind of shrunken the size of the site to not assume that the James A. Stone swimming pool is moved, whereas previously as part of the Grape Day Park master plan, one of the alternatives was to move the pool. We keep that in place and we take up a smaller portion of the site. We can see these MS4 pipes, existing pipes in these dashed lines are shown underground here, and we create these new connections into an underground storage vault, which then pumps water up into this surface feature, and the water flows through this kind of naturalized creek corridor until it returns back into the tank via gravity. So this is always just kind of recirculating when we have water in the tank, or if we supplement it with other water supply sources like reclaimed or recycled water, which we'll touch on. In terms of how this kind of operates, now we don't have any connection to Escondido Creek. Escondido Creek continues to operate just as a flood control channel as it has historically, without having any kind of management take place in here. And all of the water that's coming into here is actually being fed from the MS4 to fill up this tank, and then be able to provide the water to recirculate through this feature, which we're using not only to create kind of recreation opportunities and kind of this urban green space, but by infiltrating a lot of this water, by percolating it into the soil from the bed of this channel, we're able to treat a lot of that water and reduce some of these inflows into Escondido Creek. And so just to kind of go over a few design elements and common questions. One is that, would the pump and other facilities here be able to be powered by solar power? And they certainly would be able to. We haven't looked at this in the 30% design to try to understand what the power consumption of the site would be and where we would site solar panels to be able to power this. But it's a very feasible thing, especially in Escondido, California, to be able to use solar power to power the pump and other features of the site here. Another question is how we might use different water sources here to keep water in the creek in this surface channel for longer periods of time. So in the wet season, we're going to be able to be drawing from the MS4 water that's kind of spilling into this tank, especially when we have rain events, and filling it up. But in the summertime, that tank will go dry, and we may be able to supplement that that water supply by using reclaimed or recycled water, just to be able to keep water flowing in this creek feature as kind of a public amenity. The other advantage of being able to control this type of thing with a pump is that we can periodically let it dry out by turning off the pump for a couple days, letting all the water within here percolate or drain back into the tank, so that you don't have mosquito hazards, so that you're not creating mosquito breeding grounds here. This recirculating pool is not meant for human or pet contact. So that's one reason that we have these boardwalk features being elevated up and over the channel. It's limiting the ability of people to walk down and try to touch the water. And there will be signage and other types of things that control access here. But this is ultimately water, at least for part of the year, that's coming off of urban runoff and being treated in the tank. And we'll talk about the treatment in the next session. But it's not meant for human or pet contact at all. And there could be other features like splash pads and things that use potable water that become incorporated into the site, either on the other side of the creek over in the existing portion of Grape Day Park, or as part of this kind of expansion of Grape Day Park. So there are ways to still increase direct recreation access with potable water, but that does not include access to this channel feature. So that concludes the first session here on kind of the project background and leading into the 30% design. And then the second video is going to focus on the water quality impacts and alternative compliance.